Hello everybody, welcome to the Saroy channel, and tonight we have the most wonderful Bigfoot encounter coming to us from Robbie from somewhere in North America. So let's get started. It's a fantastic story. It's called Bigfoot Killed My Dad. Dear Sarah, I have an extraordinary tale to tell you what happened to me when I was only an 11-year-old boy. It's a story that I've never told anyone before, and I rarely thought I would be taking this story with me to my grave. It is a gruesome account of what happened to my father in the hands of the hairy monster, otherwise known as Bigfoot. I grew up in the early 50s, in a very rural, small town in North America. In those days, our town was not built up like it is today. As you can appreciate, I do not want to divulge the exact area where I lived or grew up, if you do not mind. I lived in a very beautiful part of the world, that is what I will tell you, where there were plenty of dirt roads. The rugged terrain around our humble little log cabin was wild and remote, littered with large, magnificent forests of white pine, cedar, and spruce. There was an abundance of wildlife scattered everywhere in those days, with creatures like bear, moose, elk, whitetails, wild hogs, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, hares, eagles, ravens, and you name it, we had it all. You might think that living in such an idyllic location that I had a very enviable life, but you would be wrong. On the contrary, my life as a young boy growing up was far from happy, and the only redeeming aspect of my childhood was the beautiful scenery that surrounded our cabin, and of course the wildlife, which I just loved. I would spend countless hours wrapped up in the awe of nature and exploring the beautiful forests that surrounded our property. The nearest neighbours to our home were miles away, so yes, we were extremely remote. My family was exceedingly poor in those days. I was the eldest of 6 other siblings that were much younger than myself. There were times we literally would go to bed hungry, with our stomachs growling, but my mother did everything that she could to prevent that from happening. Every menial job that my father would take in town, he was fired from, and he was lucky if he managed to hold down a job for more than 3 days. You see, my father was a drunk, and he was a nasty, horrible, monstrous kind of human being. Any money in our home he would lavish on himself, spending every last penny on alcohol, and he really did not care less whether the rest of the family went hungry or not, as long as he got his alcohol. That was all that mattered. I grew up with an intense hatred for my father. There were times that I would go to bed feeling a sense of helplessness and wishing with all my heart that I could literally blow my father's head off with a shotgun. Believe me, I fantasized about that all the time. I know that makes me sound like a horrendous person, but I want to assure your listeners that if you had witnessed what my father did to my mother on a nightly basis, you would definitely share my intense loathing for the man. Yes, you guessed right. He was almost always drunk, and he would beat my mother up on a continuous basis. Every night when I would go to bed, I could hear my father beating my mother so loudly and so hard that the lashes could be heard from my own bedroom, which I shared with 3 of my other siblings. We would all sit up listening to the loud lashing sounds coming from the living area, and we tried to cover up our ears so that we did not have to listen to the agonizing cries that would come from my mother. My younger siblings would cry in distress, but I would always beat back my own tears and sit back silently on the bed, frozen in time, as I listened to my mother's dreadful sobs. "You stupid, stupid woman," I would hear my father scream. "You ugly, stupid, pathetic woman. Look at you. This is not edible," he would shout. "Disgusting food. You are a lousy cook," he said, throwing the food on the floor. Believe me, my father shouted, undermined, and did everything he could to destroy my mother both emotionally and physically. And the worst part of it all was that she simply could not fight back. Sometimes we would wake up to find my mother with a black eye or a broken rib or something else. Of course, we were never allowed to tell anyone what had really happened to my mother. She would tell people at the local church that she was just very accident prone. You may ask me why I did not stand up to my father, but believe me, I did, and I ended up worse off than my mother. Once he beat me so much that I literally could not walk for an entire week. My mother told me that she could fight her own battles on her own, and if I was not careful, my father would kill me. So she begged me to stay out of the domestic abuse that she received on a daily basis. One day I returned home from a short trip to the forest where I had spent some time at a little creek watching the deer come by and drinking. It was something I always loved to do. I returned to find the house filled with the wrath of my father. "You stupid woman! I'm not drunk," he screamed. "When did I last drink?" He would lie. "Look at these bottles," he said, pointing to the beer in the house. "They've not been touched," he would say. "If I was a drunk, don't you think I would have drunk them already?" My mother would never say anything. We all knew only too well that the beer bottles in our house were filled with spring water, and my father had carefully managed to replace the caps on the bottles so they still looked as if the bottles had never been drunk. I knew where my father kept his stash of alcohol beverages. He had a secret place in the woodshed where he would hide all the beers and alcohol under piles of firewood. On many nights, my mother would go out into the valley outside of our wooden cabin and cry, and it would break my heart to listen to her pain. I knew how hopeless her situation had become with my abusive father. It was well known that my father had been having numerous affairs with women in the town, because when he was sober, which was not very often, he rarely knew how to turn on the charm. My mother was always pleased when he was having an affair, because those were the times he tended to ignore her and not be as aggressive or violent towards her. My mother told me once she had always hoped that my father would leave her for one of the women in town because she could be well and truly free from his clutches. She knew she could not risk leaving my father because he would probably find her and kill her. We were in no doubt that this would happen because my father was a fiercely jealous and possessive person by nature. One night we started to hear all kinds of horrible clapping sounds around our cabin. It was like something or someone was trying to get in. We knew it was not a bear because they did not make noises like this. When we heard these noises, we were all very fearful and would run to my mother's arms for comfort and support. You may wonder why my father did not do anything about the noises that we heard outside, but usually when they happened, he was completely passed out in a drunken stupor and snoring loudly on the couch, oblivious to anything happening around him. Night after night we would hear the same clapping noises around our cabin, sometimes followed by the most horrendous scream that literally went through our whole bodies. What the heck was that, I would think? One night my father was still in a drunken rage, but had not yet fallen asleep at this particular time. On this occasion, the clapping and the bashing against our cabin started all over again. My father, in his drunken stupor, opened the cabin door with a firearm in his arms and fired several warning shots in the air. The next thing I knew was my father started to scream, and then I could hear his scream grow fainter and fainter as finally it just vanished. After the first scream my father made, I had instinctively opened the door myself to see what was going on, and in horror I watched a scene that I will never ever forget for as long as I shall live. I saw a huge gargantuan creature. He was about 9 feet tall, and he was bigger than a grizzly bear in stature and in width. His shoulder and arms were massive and hung down from beyond his knees. He was a humanoid-like creature with ape-like qualities that I could see clearly in the moonlight, like the distinctive cone-shaped head. His whole body was covered with brown hair, and I saw that he had slung my father, who was screaming, over his shoulders, and was disappearing into the eastern part of the forest. Every stride he took was so huge that one footstep of his was equivalent to about 5 feet of ours. My father was dead, of that I was certain. How I knew that, I do not know, but I knew it without any doubt in my mind. My mother asked me what had happened and where was my father, but I shrugged my shoulders and told her nothing. The following day, armed with the shotgun my father had fired the previous night, that was now lying on the ground in front of the cabin, I ventured into the eastern part of the forest, which was where I had seen the creature disappear. To avoid making the story too long for you and your listeners, I did find a place in the woods that looked like it could be a nesting area for the creature I had seen the night before. It was a large area covered with grasses, leaves, and twigs, and it looked like it had been flattened by a large animal that had clearly been sleeping there, so I thought. I could see something lying submerged beneath the bracken and the twigs, and curiosity got the better of me, and so I pushed the bracken aside to see what it was. Lying in the nest was my father's foot. I knew that ugly hairy foot pretty well, and it unmistakably belonged to my dad. What I did next will surprise you and your listeners. I took my father's foot in my hand and retreated out of the forest as quickly as I could. I was terrified that the creature might see me and come after me. My heart was pounding, and I do not remember a time in my life that I have ever felt such terrible fear, because it was palpable. I finally found my way home and was so relieved not to have been followed by the creature I had seen the previous night. I was terrified that he might come after my scent and finally kill me in the same way that he had devoured my father. As strange as this sounds, I took my father's foot and buried it on our land. I know that's crazy, but I did not want anyone to know what had transpired or what had happened to my dad. Besides, I thought no one would ever believe me, even if I told them. After a few days of keeping a secret, I finally did come clean to my mother and told her in detail what had happened. My mother told me to dig up my father's foot and place it somewhere where it could be found by the authorities. This way, she told me, the finger of suspicion would not be laid at our door. Then one day the police chief and his partner came to our home to tell us that they believed that our father's foot had been found and that he must have been killed by a bear. My mother pretended to cry, and the police officers comforted her and went away, and after they left, my mother and I danced on the kitchen floor with glee. It was now well and truly over. My monstrous father was dead, he was never coming back, and the authorities had labelled the death an accident. To cut a long story short, days after my dad's death, his foot was buried in a grave on our land. We never ever bothered to give him a headstone. We were so glad he was dead, and so were all the siblings. Life suddenly started to change, and it became beautiful for us. Our little log cabin was filled with laughter and singing night after night, and there was not one occasion where we went to bed hungry or sad. As ironic as this story sounds, my mother eventually married the police chief in our town, who sadly had lost his previous wife to a bout of pneumonia, which was very common in those times. He was the gentleman that came and told my mother about the gruesome discovery of my father's foot. We all moved into a wonderful log cabin to a fancier part of town, and I gained 3 more brothers and 2 sisters. The rest of my childhood was absolutely wonderful. I never ever forgot the hairy monster, which I now know was a Bigfoot. In a strange way, as horrendous as the creature may have been, he did change my whole family's life in a positive way. So that is the end of my Bigfoot encounter. I would truly appreciate remaining strictly anonymous. Yours truly. Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful story. Until next time, good night.